and so forth. And in addition to that, and I'm not talking every coder, I mean including our translators who don't know how to write code and our graphic designer who refuses to commit anything because he's terrified of breaking something, because he doesn't know Git that well and can, touch production code and not just graphics. And the final blow up was one night. I looked into the chat room and I find out that about an hour and a half prior, nobody had told me, one of our junior coders, instead of committing to a feature branch like I told him to, committed his code to master, which in that repository automatically put it into production with a post-receive hook. So what happens is the junior coder commits some very bad code to master, which is then put on the live website, which then eats the entire database, taking the site down. He spent about 45 minutes panicking and trying to fix it himself before going into the channel and asking the project lead to help. The project lead couldn't figure it out, got two other devs and they couldn't figure out how to fix it. And I come in an hour and a half before, minute zero, or an hour and a half after minute zero and find out that this has happened. I ended up breaking out the junior dev stuff to a feature branch and hard resetting master and putting the most recent backup of the database in and making a vague apology to our support mailing list, to all the people all the teachers who lost service. This was an edgy project. And couldn't really be honest with them without pointing out who screwed up and the problems endemic to the project. I talked to the leader again, and when the leader didn't want to change it, I left. But the sad thing is this isn't uncommon. We have a lot of people who are really good coders who run open source projects who are not necessarily good at managing people. And there's a certain idea of either trying to be more democratic or more anarchist that people seem to think that means that we can't have leadership. So Eric and I are trying to provide a bit of a manual here.
Yeah.
So that others can do better in the future.
Anarchy is all very well. I'm an anarchist myself. But the way to run development projects is much the way, in my opinion, is much the way that the Russian Empire used to be run, which was despotism tempered by assassination. You really do want to have a benevolent dictator for life on most projects, and the assassination option is if you don't like your BFDL, you just fork the source and go away. Usually, this is enough of an incentive to keep the BFDL behaving in a reasonably civilized manner, and if it doesn't, you really wanted to fork the code base anyway. I'm only about a quarter joking when I say this. To some extent, the best governance structure depends on the size of the project and the background culture of the people in it. The more important architectural coherence is, the more important it is to have single-point leadership. If you're in a situation where you don't have a requirement for one architecture that gathers together all the tools,
Penguicon 2013, Building Sustainable Communities, Open Source Communities, Sunday, noon.
Normally need single-point leadership.
Right, because there are so many sub-projects that kind of do their own thing.
Right. One of the things we talked yesterday about the things we should cover, and it seems like a good time to bring up the three things that you need in order to run a successful project. One is shared objectives and culture. That's the most important thing. Without those things, none of the other things work.
Absolutely.
I often get asked, what do you think of hive mind phenomena other than software like Wikipedia and so forth? And my answer is always, those things have a problem that software projects don't, but I'm oversimplifying when I say that, because some software projects have this problem too. The thing that makes software really suitable for swarm approaches is there's generally an objective criterion of success that everyone can agree on. That's the shared objective part of the background. Software is really deterministic that way most of the time. It runs or it doesn't. It passes its acceptance tests or it doesn't. It compiles or it doesn't. Significantly, the parts of software about which there's the least agreement are the places where there's the least strong objective criteria for what's working. I mean, of course, by this user interface design. That gets off into a whole other panel. You need shared objectives and shared culture. You need leadership, and you need management. And the point of listing those two separately is that they are separate skills. Take it away.
Absolutely. When you are leading a project, you are helping create the vision, helping create the community, helping create the community around it. But management is cat herding, because at some point you have developers and they need to do things, and they hopefully need to do things in a cooperative manner, and someone needs to make this happen. When you start with a small project, for example, something where you're working with one other person or maybe two other people, the management overhead's extremely low because you can do things in an ad hoc manner. Oh, I'm going to call Eric and see what he thinks about this on my drive home. That works great when Eric and I are doing a project. When Eric and I and 35 other people are doing a project, however, that ceases to scale. So that's when you get into needing more process. Basically, when you leave the amount of developers where you can, in your head, keep track of who everyone is, what their skill set is, what they're working on, and what all the interpersonal stresses and conflicts are, that's when you need process. Hopefully you have process before that point, though. One of the things that Eric and I really wanted to talk about is the life cycle of a project and how that affects how you build the team. Because when you start a project, hopefully you're laying the groundwork for your community to grow. Unfortunately, too few communities do this. They say, oh, we don't really need management because there's 3 of us. And then all of a sudden there's 15 of them, and they try to impose that structure as the project goes through all its growing pains, and that comes at a much, much higher cost than having a good foundation to begin with, especially if the place where you're falling down is culture.
Yeah.
I've worked in projects where we have culture problems. I hate to do this to people on camera, but
Wait,
okay.
before you go on talking about culture, I want to give an operational definition of culture.
Excellent.
Okay. Your developers have a common culture to a good first approximation if they laugh at the same jokes.
Yes, absolutely.
There are other indices you can use, but this one is really reliable. The question is, do they laugh at the same jokes?
And that's a great intro to how I was going to describe Drupal's current community problems. I've been a Drupal developer for about 10 years. I'm a little less active now than I was back then. I've been doing some other work for my main source of income, so I've been doing a lot less Drupal. But one of the things I saw as Drupal grew is it lacked this idea of we have a common culture as Drupal people or as hackers. There was this idea that we all come from disparate cultures and we need to be sensitive to that, which sounds really egalitarian, and it's not. On projects run by more old school people, I have
Get off my lawn.
I still have school, there's a difference. I'm 30 and I'm kind of
School
old
was
school.
the part that you threw in at the end, so you shouldn't be blatantly calling them old in the middle of the talk.
Now I blatantly call them old all the time.
On Google Plus, I posted this story about a Mormon bishop, 47-year-old guy, who a woman was being mugged in front of his house, and he chased the mugger away with a samurai sword. The guy's a martial artist, he's been training for years. One of the things I got in the comments is one of my regulars said, wow, 47, who would have thought somebody so old could swing a sword? I replied, me trout slaps Justin with a fish.
So anyhow, on projects run by more old school leaders, I have, as a fairly young pagan woman, worked with someone who was an evangelical Christian who was as sure of the sun rising as he was that I was going to burn in hell forever and ever and ever. And we didn't know that for years. We worked side by side and we never had an issue. And it didn't come out until we'd known each other, I think, 6.5 years. And that's because we had a shared hacker culture. My son, when he was 8 years old, put it more succinctly than anyone else I can ever think of. I was actually giving a talk on hacker culture to an open source group in my home state of Indiana, and my son is trying desperately to explain Hunt the Wumpus to some confused developer, and I'm getting confused looks. Hunt the Wumpus is a text-based game. There's a Wumpus, it is smelly, you can't see it, you have to shoot it with arrows that don't go straight. There's more, but that'll suffice for the moment. My 8-year-old is trying desperately to explain Hunt the Wumpus to some confused adult developer, and finally the developer looks at him and says, "So why do you think this is important?" Lucas looks at him and goes, "You're a grown-up? I'm 8 years old. If you don't know this, what do we have to talk about?"
Wow.
And that is the best explanation ever of why shared culture is important.
So I'm going to oversimplify again. Over the years I've been asked many times, what is the best litmus test for whether someone is a hacker or not? And I finally found one. There is an RFC called RFC 1149, which is transmission of TCP/IP packets over avian carriers. If you put that in front of somebody and they laugh, they're a hacker.
Oh, we're getting blank stares. Try running a computer network over carrier pigeon.
Yeah. You duct tape representations of the packets to the pigeon's legs. This was actually done once in Norway by a Linux user group. There is video. It is hilarious.
I want to see this because I always wondered if anyone had ever tried to implement that.
It was actually been, and I actually saw the archive of their mailing list argument over the fact that in order to avoid animal cruelty charges, they didn't use duct tape. They used electrical tape. They had a long argument over whether that was actually conformant to the.
I love it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people, when they talk about shared culture and building a project, they think that it's all about selection. And while yes, I would love to select a bunch of really bright and experienced hackers who are already part of hacker culture, eventually they die off, get hit by buses, or get interested in projects that are not my thing I want them to work on. So, it is quite necessary.
I love how you equate that with dying and getting hit by buses.
Well, I have very specific priorities. So every community, once it grows beyond a handful of developers, really desperately needs, in order to maintain its health in the long term,
It leads
a
to
process for
learn how to
indoctrinating
acculturate
new people. And I kind of like indoctrinating because it's, a culture is, I think a lot of people think that they should be gentle about it. I tend not to be. We have, people don't come in knowing hacker culture. I don't think anyone was born here knowing what IP over avian carrier was. My 8-year-old regularly has to explain Hunt the Wumpus to people. I don't know if my son or I gets more hacker points for the fact that my son actually introduced Eric to a piece of hacker culture. Lucas, aka Little Fish, can take credit for all of the patches to Robot Finds Kitten by Eric S. Raymond.
Yes.
Wow. How did you not run into that?
Who the fuck knows? I didn't know about it until last year.
Last Halloween, we were making a robot costume for Halloween, and Lucas asked if he could borrow Andrew's cat Calypso so that he could be Robot Finds Kitten when he trick-or-treated. I pointed out that no one in the neighborhood would understand this, but I was in favor of the gesture, and then I let him call Eric because I figured Eric, of all people, would at least give Lucas the laugh he was hoping for. I got a good laugh when Eric didn't get it.
What's a Robot Finds Kitten? So they pointed me at it, and I played it, and I laughed and laughed and laughed, and I immediately joined the dev team, and really they've been pushing out another release.
So you can blame my son for that.
Which, by the way, is why the most recent edition of Robot Finds Kitten.
Is as hard as Battle was not?
No. No, but one of the objects in it is a carrier pigeon with a TCP/IP packet dumped into its leg.
Nice.
Speaking speaking of Battle for Westnoff illustrates another mode of failed project leadership. And it's something I've had real problems with recently. Battle for Westnoff used to have a project lead. Everybody respected him. Everybody still does respect him. Then he decided he didn't want to run things and retired. And no leadership structure, no single leader ever stepped up after that. The result is, for as long as I've been involved with the project, which is a little over 6 years now, it has been run by a loose committee of senior devs, which for most of that time has included me. The problem was that when that loose committee of senior devs couldn't reach a pretty solid consensus, things didn't get done or there was serious acrimony. And in the last few weeks, I've been dealing with a serious acrimony situation over where we host the project now that it looks like GNA isn't stable anymore. It's just been really ugly, and it has really made me wish that there was somebody who could make a decision binding on the project, even if it wasn't the decision I agreed with. So, yeah, that's something you have to deal with too sometimes. What happens when the leader goes away?
Is succession planning part of good project management before the leader leaves?
Absolutely, if at all possible. I was on the staff at the Freenode IRC network just prior to Rob Levin's death. I had stepped down a couple of days prior due to my spouse at the time having some problems that I really needed to attend to. And then Rob literally was hit by a truck. Car? Okay. Was hit by a motor vehicle and died at the hospital soon after. We were very sorry to lose him, but one of the things that was hard from a network perspective was that there was no successor in place. And the project kind of foundered. There were a couple of board member changes and some staff changes, and it turned out that I was the only person around who had copies of important documents like the bylaws to the 501c3 and things like that, which wasn't great because those who had come to leadership in the network were not really happy with me for having stepped down, to the point that I had to pass the documents to staff through a third party. This is what happens when you don't have a clear line of succession.
Right. And this is why, if you find yourself founding a project, one of the things that you need to do, even if it's a small project, is designate 1 or 2 lieutenants. It may not matter at the scale of a small project because you may not have more people than 1 or 2 lieutenants and some casual contributors. The important thing about designating a lieutenant is that that implicitly creates a line of succession. And you want that even if your project is small.
Absolutely. And even if you have 2 or 3 lieutenants, if they all get along fairly well enough, they'll decide amongst them who has time to take over project lead. It's really the issue where nobody's in charge that we're trying to get away from. If you have 3 bright people with relatively good social skills, any of the 3 would probably be equally good as a benevolent dictator, but lack of a benevolent dictator will be disastrous no matter how bright the people on the project are.
Yeah, that's a situation with the project I'm in. We have a benevolent dictator who is widely admired, greatly loved, and just barely this side of being completely burned out.
I have seen that before. I've been the one who's about burnt out before.
Yeah.
There's a theory in early leadership for those of us that got stuck taking, this is why these lieutenants work so darn well, is that you can't really tightly manage more than about 3 people. If you're doing it as a part-time volunteer project, that number decreases rapidly. So having a small group of people that are coming to you and then dispersing those decisions out to the wider project not only makes sense for succession, it also prevents that burnout because you're not having to deal with every problem that comes up.
In the civilian world, in business schools, they tell you the maximum fan out is 4. Of course, they aren't dealing with the kind of stress that you are in combat leadership.
Right. I'll say that for a very, very experienced project lead in open source, I can usually handle 6 to 7 if they're all competent and if we have the shared culture and the other infrastructure in place. Even beyond that, I don't scale. Now, I think this is probably a good time to break for questions before we move on to managing growing pains because you were first, I think.
So, problem members.
Honestly, there are different kinds of problem children, and I tend to handle them differently. I'm going to make gross overgeneralizations here in order to break them down into categories in a quick way. One is the little kids, the people who are really well-meaning and probably have a lot of potential, but they're immature and tend to cause drama. Basically, your choice is either some mature member of the community has to have the time to make the commitment to babysit them and help them grow up, or you have to get rid of them because they can be a source of lots of drama. But if you manage to convert one of those into a grown-up, they will be some of the best contributors you'll ever have. It's just a labor-intensive process. People who are control freaks, just plain incompetent and not willing to learn, and most other people who are negligently problematic. They're not trying to cause problems, they just do because of some personality problem or whatever. You assess how much energy will this take to try to help them fix, or can we encourage them to move on? If you make it so that their drama causing doesn't work, most of those subtypes are just going to move on. If the culture of your project is robust enough that them shouting at the mailing list is going to make people roll their eyes and not answer them, that's incredibly effective.
Right.
You had something.
Then we get into the more serious cases. Sometimes you'll get somebody who's actually competent, but more or less an habitual troll. It can be really hard to know what to do with those people.
Well, and often what you do is you take some of the other classes of problem and feed them to those people. I know you've done that several times. Well, this person doesn't work, let's feed them to Tree Lane.
That may have happened once or twice. But it really is. The problem children that you feed to the competent troll tend to either go, oh my God, I want to be that smart, but I don't want people to feel about me like they do about that guy, and they shape up. Or they get chewed up and spit out. It's not exactly a nice way to handle things, but it is incredibly effective. But really, I tend to, I very seldomly will explicitly kick someone out of the community. I think that in 11 years of, oh my God, I'm old. In 11 years since I started managing medium to large open source projects, I've done it twice. And one of the cases was enough of an outlier that the police were called on someone.
Right. I've never had to do it, but don't try to take too many lessons from that, because I tend to run my projects very small and tight. I've seldom run a very large group because I'm seldom needed to.
And I've done a lot of my work in the edu space, which means, oh, by the way, you have 75 people on this project about 6 months after it starts, which is a lot of people to manage and it's very rapid growth. Anyway, any other questions?
Yeah, it's something I'm curious about. I'm a project manager for the state of Michigan.
Okay.
And I have 3 developers in the DBA that report to me. I'm not a developer, so someone wants to talk about the intricacies of code. It goes totally over my head. But that works fine for me because my role is to make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, and we set objectives, and enforce accountability and that sort of thing. How would is that the same or different? Would that work in an open source project?
We have a very strong tradition of peer leadership.
Right.
If you can't write code, you don't get to lead.
Okay.
Now I will say that recently Eric and I had a conversation. The project that inspired this, as I was getting ready to leave, one of the things that was considered was a couple people on the project asked if I was willing to take a leadership position, at least temporarily, during a restructure. And I looked around, and I was certainly one of the lead coders on this project, but there were 2 people there who were grossly better coders than me. They were also markedly less social. And as one of the group of lead coders, I think that I would have had the cred to do that had the rest of the things been in place for me to want to take a leadership position and fix things there. So you don't need to be the best coder who outshines
That's
everyone
correct.
around you. but you need to have some credit. You need to be able to show that you can hold your own, that you understand the code that you're working on, and that you can make sound technical decisions.
That's not universal.
What?
The project that I mentioned, the lead person came to it as head of QA, and she can build the project barely.
That's highly unusual.
And she is respected and greatly loved.
That's highly unusual.
That's interesting, but it's an outlier. It's awesome that it works. Do not expect it to work in the general case. She must be an exceptional lady to have pulled it off.
Just to make sure I'm wrapping my head around right, when you're talking about communities, are you talking about just the people who have, say, commit rights on Git, or are you talking about everybody, including people who don't do code but actively file awesome bug reports?
Anyone who's involved in making the project in any way, even if you're just the person who, like me on Fun 2, I show up, I break things, I say, hey, this broke a lot.
Let's talk about some of those layers.
Okay.
It will help achieve some definiteness. First of all, I don't generally use the word community. This is a difference between me and SH. I don't generally describe the groups I'm in as communities because, well, the word has connotations I don't actually want. It brings to mind people singing Kumbaya around the campfire. Fuck that noise, we're here to get work done. I generally refer to my groups as projects.
This highlights the difference in our background. Community means a very different thing for me. I grew up in a small farming community, so oh shit, there was a tornado, you get people from the community and we just fix it. You don't have emergency services and tons of government personnel. You grab a bunch of farmers, you divert water, you start a warming center in the elementary school, and you get on with life.
This is
you need to build a barn, you grab a bunch of people from the community and hammers and nails.
This is probably an urban-rural difference.
Probably.
Anyway, so I tend to refer to the working groups that I'm in as projects. And let me talk about the layers and levels of project commitment. At the core of the project, you generally have a leadership, which is commonly one benevolent dictator, sometimes a committee with voting. Apache has a committee with voting. If you have a benevolent dictator, the benevolent dictator will generally have lieutenants, usually no more than 3. On very large projects, it may be more. That is, again, an outlier. Beyond the lieutenants, you have a relatively hardcore of people who are regular committers and may own various major subsystems. Okay? Typically, this is up to a dozen people. Then around those hardcore committers, you will have a cloud of people who have a relatively long-term association with the project, but are fairly casual committers. Every once in a while you get a patch or a feature or a bug report and your reaction is, oh yeah, I know that guy. Okay? And then beyond that, there's a sort of very diffuse halo of people who show up once, go, hey, here's a patch that fixes a bug I just found, and you look at it and you go, oh, that's good, and you never see the person again. So that outer halo of one-time committers and patch submitters sort of trails off into the interstellar void in an indefinite way. It used to be, and actually the criterion for who's in and who's out has become a little more definite in the last few years because of the widespread use of version control of public repositories. Now, who is a member of a project is usually identified by who has commit rights on the repo. We didn't have a criteria in that sharp before.
It depends on the project. I tend to think of a lot of people as members who don't necessarily have commit rights yet but are headed in that direction. Because there are people that we're actively cultivating and trying to nudge in that direction. And feeling affiliation with the project is a big component of making them make that investment.
Aspirants, candidates, not yet admitted to the initiation.
Yes, something like that.
But just to follow up, and maybe I'm talking about something that's completely out of the scope of what you're talking about, but the example I'm going to use is developing open source games.
Okay.
Where you have the coders, and they might be anywhere from maybe 3 active people, and the layers that you're describing might, just to go in order quickly, might be like 3, 10, then 12. Like the middle layer, there's a lot of people. But then you have this community of, say, maybe 20, 30, 50 people who you're trying to teach to write good bug reports.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Because the testing for games is much more
those
extensive
would be
than
your
say doing.
experts.
yeah,
Those are your aspirants. The people who are not quite in the community, but they definitely, you want to give them a sense of affiliation, because when you include them, they're more willing to invest in the project, and they're more willing to invest their time and energy to learn to do useful things like file good bug reports.
yeah, it's actually a significant social transition when somebody gets commit rights.
Yes.
That's true on every project.
Because that's the point where you can bring